Hello, and welcome to this edition of EMS Now Up Close. I am Eric Miskell with EMS Now, and my guest today is Kevin Arvidson. He is the CTO at White Horse Labs. Of course, we all know White Horse Labs as a global leader in quality assurance and supply chain integrity. Um, but I've never had an opportunity to speak to Kevin before, so when he was put forward as a potential victim, I jumped at the opportunity. And Kevin, thanks for taking the time. I know there's quite a time difference between us here, but thank you for staying up late to share some thoughts with me.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Why don't you begin by introducing yourself and what your role is exactly there at White Horse Labs?
Sure. So, as you said, my name is Kevin Arvidson. I've been in the Asian region working in high performance computing and IT and software and AI now for about 15 years, specifically in the Hong Kong and Chinese side, also doing a lot with Seoul in South Korea.
Mhm.
And my role in Whitehorse is I've been a CTO and I've been currently focusing a lot of or on HPC computing products that we've been putting out to our customers to help them navigate the unique situation that everyone is finding themselves in now.
Okay. So let's dig into that a little bit because that's what we wanted to talk about was the HPC. Um, maybe so in your world when you're talking about define kind of what that is and exactly and what it is that you're doing there.
Sure, so HPC, high performance computing, it can really take on multiple roles. It really depends on the enterprise that you're talking to, but in general, it's usually based cloud based. Like if you're going to server farms, it could also hit things like university research hubs. They've got these really fast computers that takes a lot more energy and takes a lot more components to work than just say a standard workstation. So imagine it like a much larger version of a library for engineers, but it
Yeah.
takes a lot more people to upkeep it.
Hmm.
And it also requires a higher level of understanding of the hardware and the software to get them to work correctly.
Now, yeah, I know kind of the history of Whitehorse. So how did this service come about?
So this service came about when Mark and I were having dinner. It was now about 2 years ago. And we've been working on some AI projects together. Um, at that time, we hadn't launched it, but I kind of told him, I said, look, I have a feeling that we're about to see a major shift in the market. And it was based on what I saw just being the CTO and being around the industry with hardware and software. It was starting to get harder for people that I knew to get the material, whether it was discrete components or assembled components, even basic things like people trying to build their own boards. It was suddenly getting really hard to get the correct stuff. And they were noticing that they were getting, even from legitimate suppliers, most of the time by accident, some secondhand parts. And it was just because there was already shortages at that time. So I told him, I said, look, there's going to be a market here. Something's going on. And the amount of material that the big boys are buying, the hyperscalers are buying, it's not sustainable if the smaller people are going to still want to get this. The memory shortage, for example, was inevitable. You can't have two or three big players in the market buying up, each of them saying they're buying 40% of the global supply chain. Well, that math doesn't work. So who are they taking it from? Who's not getting it? Who's getting that allocation that didn't have the allocation before? And where are they going to take that from? Because you can only make so much.
Mm.
So that's really where it started. I said, like, I think there's going to be a shortage here. We should start hitting this. And so then that we kind of agreed together that it's something that I should put more effort on, or some more R&D effort on, and that really kind of led us down that path. And now we have viable reports and specific protocols designed for HPC.
Okay. And who are your customers in that area then? Who do you do this for? Not by name, obviously, but type of company.
Right, right.
Right. Uh,
So there are multiple types of people in the industry that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. Some of them would be traders, so global traders who are getting all of a sudden getting orders for parts that they've never had to work with before, right? If you were doing basic components before, say chip level components, and all of a sudden you're getting asked for tens of thousands of modules, memory modules instead of
Mhm.
memory chips, you don't really know what you're looking at, right? Because you've never dealt with that before, so you don't really know what's the difference between this and that, and how do we tell the quality and so on. So that's a lot of the people that we're talking to is that trade level because the market, the hyperscaler market, has had to go outside of their supply chain that they'd already built up because there was a supply chain for tens of years, yeah, since the 1980s.
Okay.
Oracle's been around for a long time. They've been making servers for a long time. So they this hyperscalers would have to go out all of a sudden and reach out to people they've never dealt with before. That's really what we're seeing right now is that the hyperscalers kind of driven it. They're driving people out to the outer edges of the supply
Mm-hmm.
chain, which is then turned around and brought people looking back in, like, well, where do we get this material? How do we test it? How do we know if it's real or not? And so
Yeah.
on. So that's really kind of where that's coming from.
Okay. So I appreciate that. Thank you. Let's kind of go big picture too. I know you kind of give a sense of the kind of a global overview of the HPC market here in 2025 as we're ending. I'm assuming it's a booming, growing market, right?
So the conservative estimates that I've heard is 2025 should close around the 60 billion mark. And next couple of years, you're looking at 80 to 140 billion, maybe more. From what I understand, it's going to be about 7 to 10% growth per year. That's conservative, in my opinion. I think the reason why it's not bigger is because they just can't make enough. If they could make more, the growth
Mhm.
would be more.
Okay. That's interesting. Um, so, as with any growing technology or industry, there's always pain points. So, what do you see as kind of some of the key pain points in the market today?
Well, by far, the biggest pain point for the hyperscalers is going to be managing their downtime. And downtime can happen for multiple reasons, whether it's a part failure or an energy shortage. They just couldn't get scaled fast enough, so they've got downtime for their clients. They might have over promised something that they can do, or even security risks. We saw two major security things happen this year, right? Within 2025. How do you mitigate that downtime? Is you have to have the devices in your servers, so the material has to work, has to
Hmm.
be legitimate, it has to be authentic, and it has to be built for that purpose. If
Yeah.
you're trying to build tens of thousands of servers and you can't get the right memory, for example, and you put consumer memory into it, it doesn't have ECC chips. But what are you going to do there when all of a sudden you've got all these issues? You've got downtime because you didn't put the correct servers in there. If you're building or managing these massive HPC facilities, you have probably never had to deal with something like this before
Hmm.
because you would have made phone calls to the big boys and you would have said, "Give me 10,000 SSDs, right? Or give me 10,000 memory modules," and it would have been like, "Yeah, okay, no problem," because they were making them anyway, and you had a good relationship with them, so you could get it. Now there's so much allocation pressure going elsewhere that you suddenly are running into people that you never had to fight for allocation for before. Right. So now you've got people, and I'm not going to drop any names,
No.
but some behemoths in the industry that have now started calling all their people that they never would have dealt with before and said, "Give me all of your supply of chips." And you say, are you going to say no to that? Of course not. But then that means that you, as a hyperscaler, you have to have a certain amount of material on hand at every single site to make sure that if a server goes down, you have to hot swap it out. So now
Hmm.
you're running out of that material. So where are you going to go and buy that? You have to buy from a second source that you didn't have to deal with before. So the major pain point is how do we get this material? If you're a hyperscaler or you're running these server farms, you're running these HPC in like a university, how do I get supply? How do I keep supply? And how
Hmm.
do I make sure that the supply I have on hand is legitimate and will work?
Yeah.
Because if I'm going to take the server down, every second that is down costs me $9,000. Right. So if that's the cost analysis, you're thinking like, well, I better overbuy now because if I have to spend $9,000 a minute for downtime, I'm going to overbuy.
Yeah.
That leads to even more shortages because now you're buying two instead of one. Right. So it's just kind of a perpetual issue now that everyone's causing their own shortages, and that's really where the pain point is.
Wow. You really make a point for the service you provide there with the testing, right? Because I'm with these different security risks with it, both in hardware and also the as you just indicated, the attacks that happen. It puts everything at risk constantly, and if you're not assured of what's in there, you're at greater risk.
Oh, absolutely. And we really haven't even touched on the biggest security risk, which is we when you're dealing with something that's like a single chipset, for
Hmm.
example, there's not a lot that can be done to do a hardware attack, right? So a hardware Trojan.
Hmm.
But if you're dealing with a say a motherboard that goes into a server, there can be thousands of components on that.
Yeah.
So how are you going to check? Are you going to check every single component on the motherboard before you put it into your server farm to make sure that there's no hardware, there's no device on on that motherboard that shouldn't be there? Are you going to know what that is? Probably not, right? Because you also might not even realize that you got the 2023 version of that motherboard instead of the 2025 version of that motherboard, which is going to affect something downstream. Because a lot of these processes that are being written to run on these virtual machines for these servers, they are designed to work with specific hardware. Right. It's probably sitting, if it's something new, it's going to be in a set of Kubernetes or it might be in a Docker, which means it should be hardware agnostic, but not always. I work in IT for a long time. It's not always perfect. Things break, you make mistakes. So now you have to worry about, I have a scalability issue because I need to make sure that every single piece of hardware I put in my server farm doesn't have any hardware Trojans in it. And how do I check for that?
Yeah. You remind me of the old saying that offense always stays a little ahead of defense, right? It's just
Offense is always ahead of defense.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and we're really seeing that now. Like, we're seeing that, like I said, there's been a couple of issues this year. We're not going to name any names. They know who they are. And not all of them were caused because of or Trojans, but
Mhm.
they could have been very much prevented
Mhm.
with following the correct procedures and making sure that everything was secure before they say launched it or before they built what they built.
Mhm.
It, if you're in this industry, you probably know what I'm talking about, and you can understand why I'm not naming names on that.
Yeah.
They know who they are, and hopefully they
Yeah.
get better.
So is that, at the beginning you referenced that you have it's a protocol that you've established and that you provide there and you
Correct.
have reporting based on that. Is that what you mean here too, the protocol for how to do this most effectively?
Yeah, correct. So one of the things that I hit really hard originally as the first project that we did was CPU testing, because CPUs, obviously GPU, everyone's talking about GPUs right now, but CPUs are in every server. You can't have a GPU farm without a CPU. Everything has to go through the CPU. So if you are, whether your memory is sitting in proper like RAM memory, which means it should be more secure than SSDs, or you're running a GPU farm, it doesn't matter. It all has to channel through your CPU. So the biggest pain point that I was getting at is that if we have a shortage of CPUs, that could cause major security risks for our clients because now how do they know that the data that they are ingesting and pushing out to their end customer is secure and safe? So we need to find a way to test and authenticate these CPUs to make sure not only are they the correct CPU that they think they're buying, but there's nothing in between, right? There's
Mm,
nothing data logging, for example. So that was part of the protocols I was originally designing is how do we ensure that they're not just getting the correct CPUs, but they're not full of hardware Trojans, they're not full with extra material and so on.
yeah. Okay. So how much more challenging does this become with the emerging technologies? And I'm thinking specifically like AI everything these days, right? I mean, it says AI is driving the construction of all these servers, all of these data farms, right? So how much, I'm assuming that just makes things that much more challenging and faster pace.
I would say faster pace for sure, and the level of urgency that we're seeing at the end client side
Hmm.
um, is unlimited. Right. I believe the quote last year from a Google exec was, "It's better to overbuy than be left behind."
Mm,
So they are buying two times, four times, eight times what they actually need and will ever use, because it's better for them to buy it than their competitors to buy it. So what that means, though, is that that's creating even more shortages. And actually, the amount of memory, the amount of raw material that these servers really require today is not what they're buying.
mm,
So this is kind of an artificial shortage because they're overbuying stuff because they have to overbuy because everyone is overbuying. But when that happens long enough, that's the new market, right? Because what's next after this?
yeah.
They're going to keep making new GPUs. Are they going to keep making the same GPUs just faster? And we've seen this happen for the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years based on Turing law. We know where this is going to go. So I think actually the emerging threat and the emerging that's going to completely change the industry, at least how I see it, is not necessarily AI. I think it's a combination of wetware and quantum. I think that's the stuff that's kind of future out,
Yeah.
like 5, 10 years out, but it's going to completely throw everything upside down.
Mhm. Well, that's a scary future outlook, isn't it? That, I mean, we're advancing, but yet the risks are staying just apace with, and I guess that's always the way it is in industry, though, especially technology.
I don't know. I don't think it's scary. I think it's fantastic, actually. I think the future looks very bright. Mm.
Okay. Well, well, talk about that then. How do you see, when you look at the current landscape today and compare it to the future directions where it's going? Uh, as you're saying, these technologies are evolving, going, but there will always be a need for the type of protocols and services that you're providing then.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's why I say the future is very bright because as you, there hasn't been that much innovation. And I know I could get hit really hard with people online. They're going to tell me I'm wrong on this, but there hasn't been that much real innovation in some of the space that we've seen in technology for the last
Mhm.
30 years. Stuff kind of, you can see that curve of like it gets really hot and then innovation's there. And then it kind of, we've done what we can with that technology. For
Hmm.
me, the emergence of machine learning, because I don't like to call it AI because it's not really AI yet. It's really more machine learning based. The emergence of machine learning is driving us into really cool spaces. So we're going to see completely new designs for things that nobody would have thought of before. I think, say, China, for example, is really exciting because they're coming up with some really crazy ideas and really cool ideas of how to solve hardware problems and how to solve uh, because they're exascaling so high. How do you solve problems with energy?
Mhm.
They have more energy than everyone else, and yet they still see the same issues that we're going to run out. So I see a lot of really exciting innovation that has to come in order for this to work. And for me, with White Horse, that's exciting because it means that we can pay attention to it and we can start fighting new problems. And we're going to have to find solutions for hacks that we never even knew existed before because it was a piece of hardware that didn't exist 2 years ago. So now we have to figure out how do we authenticate something that was not a thing 5 years ago, all of a sudden is a thing. and someone is faking it. So how do we prove that it's real? So for me, I think it's really exciting. I think I love it because it
Yeah.
means that we can't just sit and do nothing. It kind of shows in the industry which third-party laboratories like White Horse are willing to take chances on new products, are willing to take and put money onto R&D for new things that maybe haven't even hit the market yet, but we can still test it when it does. I think that's really showing who are the leaders in the industry and who are just a follower.
Wow. Yeah, I'm just trying to conceive of how much, I mean, how sharp White Horse has to stay from a training, from being involved in the technology, right? And that's ongoing and will never cease because as this emerges, the challenges, whatever that is, the technologies, you have to stay in pace with it.
Absolutely. You have to keep your head on the ground and in space at the same time, right? Because you have to see who's doing the real engineering that people are buying, say, on the shelf in the US right now.
Mhm.
What materials on the shelf today that we need to know how to test and authenticate for our clients. But then we also need to have that head in space to kind of look at what's on the horizon because it's not clear who's going to win the certain markets and who's going to come up with the craziest ideas. Folding screens weren't a thing before, right?
Mhm.
Who, if you were to tell me 15 years ago that we would have cell phones this big that could fold
Yeah.
in 2025, I was like, that's more of a 2035 thing, not a 2025 thing. So you never know who's going to really push that. And you probably would never have said that was going to come out of China, right? They'd
Mm.
probably be like, no, it'll be US, right? The innovators, the US. It wasn't though. So yeah, you have to have face on the ground and face up in the sky and kind of just point somewhere and say, okay, we have to be there. Somewhere in
Yeah.
between is where you want to be.
Yeah. No, I like that imagery. That's very good. So, what do you see as the future outlook then in the opportunities in HPC testing?
Short term, we've got we've got the flash shortage, which is pretty serious right now.
Mhm.
And I don't think we've seen the end of that. I think we're not even close to being in the middle of the flash shortage from what I see. And we also have the memory shortage. And that also, I think, is nowhere close to being finished. Uh, I make that claim not because I have some secret magic ball, but because I see what other companies that are manufacturing or selling to end consumers, like B2C, they're starting to get rid of some of their B2C products to go B2B.
Mm,
Right. So if you were selling, for example, if you were a person making memory that was being used in consumer computers, all of a sudden you're switching everything over to be hyperscaled computers, HPC or something like that. They must see something that we don't see. There must be a reason for that. Otherwise, you're not going to abandon a profitable product line. So
yeah.
I think those two things are going to affect us, not just Whitehorse, but globally as consumers.
Mhm.
And it's going to change a lot of where the market is going to go. And it might also change how people are developing new products because if they say, well, we're going to have a shortage of this, we shouldn't use that, for example. I think that's going to have a huge effect downstream. Um, Future trends, say like if you want to take 5, 10 years in the future, authentication testing for things like quantum computing is going to be absolutely imperative because we know, or it should be clear to most people in our industry, that there's going to be a fusion between traditional HPC and quantum computing. They're going to have to work together. So we today, because there's not that many people out there who are selling quantum computing that are able to be, say, installed in a server farm, but they are available. It's at such a small scale that there's not a lot of need for the testing yet, but it's going to come because
Mhm.
as that business gets bigger and bigger, and as software catches up to the hardware for that, then there's going to be more pressure on the general global supply chain to supply that
Mhm.
to HPC. I think that is very clear that that is going to be a really, really big market, especially for White Horse as well, because you're going to have to know, is the data that we're putting in and the data that's coming out, is it accurate?
Hmm.
Right. So that's a part of also the security side, is there's going to be a lot of additional material that's going to be put into computers and servers to authenticate security wise that the bits that were put in are the bits that come out, for example. And there wasn't anything crossing in between, and it's not sending it somewhere else.
Hmm.
So there's stuff that's on the horizon that is not really announced yet in the general market that's going to be doing that. And I think that's going to be super hot for us, um, in a testing way, because if you don't test it, then you can't prove that it's working.
Mm.
And if you can't prove it's working, then why are you going to buy it?
Yeah. Before I let you go, let me just ask, a lot of our audience tends to be EMS companies, the electronic contract manufacturers. Based on what we've been talking about, any kind of best practices or words of advice you might offer that audience?
Yeah. So the industry has really kind of split into three parts because of the way that the market has moved between the differences between Asia, Europe, and the US. For US, because US tends to be more innovation based, they're doing things that are more on the edge of
Mhm.
technology, and they're doing it faster in general. They're pushing faster, which means that they're going to run into a lot of issues with, say, products that are not fully ready to be put in a deployed environment that's supposed to be 24/7. So my advice to them is, maybe they haven't seen the need to do it before, but they should do it now, to start doing things like thermal testing and make sure that they're running these things that they're building fully loaded for extended periods of time, to make sure that they're not missing something. Because the last thing you want to do is have built this gigantic, beautiful server farm, hand over the keys to someone else, and then you get a call in 2 months because the entire US internet crashed because of one issue.
Yeah.
That I think is very important in the US market. In the European market, we see a lot of the pressure is coming from the energy issue.
Mhm.
Um, Non-authentic components tend to use energy less efficiently than authentic components. So if you don't test for authenticity, you're going to run in major issues later. And those are really hard to find right away. So if you're trying to find, say, is this part authentic or not based on, does it do what I need it to do, you can get that answer really, really quickly if you know how to do it. If it's a good enough non-authentic part, it's still going to give you the right answer. For example, it might be working like a CPU, look like a CPU. However, it might be using 20 to 30% more energy that that CPU would not have before. You're not going to see that for a couple of months until you realize that, oh dear, my energy bill is 20% higher than it should be, right? Now I have to run into government regulations because my server farm does not qualify for X, Y, and Z. You start getting phone calls from the state saying, hey, you're using more energy than you're approved for. That is a major, major issue. So they need to keep that in mind. They should be careful with that, and they need to do their testing, to make sure. And that's more of a long-term testing. That's more specialized, I
Yeah.
should say. For Asia, Asia is absolutely being driven by the exascaling that China is doing right now. And that is just pure material going in. And I smile because I think it's so cool to watch. They're
Mhm.
going from these small, not fully capable server farms to all of a sudden they've got these server farms that are 10, 20 times more powerful than anyone thought was possible.
Yeah.
And they're going to keep doing that. And it's very clear that there is an initiative to hit that as fast as possible and as hard as possible. So my advice to the Asian side: don't slow down because you can't. But don't think that means that you shouldn't do. testing, and that you shouldn't be looking out for issues because they are kind of in a tough situation because they happen to be surrounded by so many more parts because China, not just China specifically, but say China, Singapore, Korea, Japan, they're where all this stuff is made. They're where all this stuff is being done anyway. So they get a lot more material to work with. That also means they need to be more careful with where they're choosing, where they're getting it from, and
Mhm.
how they're testing it, and make sure that they're testing it in approved laboratories like White Horse, for
Yeah.
example. Because otherwise, you don't really know if the answer you got was correct or not, and it'd be too late. Because if you hyperscaled as fast as you did, as China, and all of a sudden you realize that boy, we bought 20,000 of those and they're not going to work. Oof, it's a
Yeah.
pretty tough pill to swallow.
Yeah. That was excellent. Thank you. I like the way you broke it down by regions. I think that's very relevant, and I think our audience will appreciate that. So thank you for that. But Kevin, thank you too for coming on. I'm glad Mark suggested I speak to you because this has been fascinating, and it's a good insight into a piece of the White Horse that I haven't seen before, and I think that the people will appreciate learning about. So thank you for your excellent comments and the way you look at the market. It's fascinating to me.
Thank you. Yeah, my pleasure. You can
Yeah.
invite me back on.
Oh, good. Well, I was going to say, hopefully, this didn't leave a bad taste in your mouth, and you're willing to come back sometime. So, um,
Yeah, not at all.
excellent. Well, listen, thank you. I know it's late where you are, early where I am. So, thanks for staying up to do this. And it's the end of the year, so I also wish you very happy holidays.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you, sir.